All right, people are starting to trickle in now, so I will. Should I kick things off here, Katie?
Yeah, you want me to go to the next slide, see if I can figure that out? Nailed it.
All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to our latest webinar on the last day of the quarter. So we're celebrating that over here. This webinar is how to enable your revenue teams with competitive intelligence. And this one's actually a really exciting webinar. We've got two of our own team members leading this one today. Katie Berg, our director of marketing, and an anonymous source said the Meryl Streep of webinars. I can't reveal who.
My God.
that's what sources are.
What a lie.
That's what sources are saying. I don't reveal my sources, but that's the rumor. And also Nirsan, who is a competitive program strategist on our team here, and he's specialized in guiding enterprise organizations into building and scaling their competitive enablement strategies. So I'm really excited to have both of them with us today. Also, I think we just skipped over the housekeeping, my favorite slide of them all. The housekeeping, we are recording the presentation, so it will be sent to you afterwards. I believe it should be, Zoom does its thing for a couple hours. It'll be sent to you in the morning or a couple hours after. And submit your questions anytime. We have a chat box. Fire away into the chat box. Just let me know where you're coming from, where you're watching this, just to make sure it's all working. And yeah, submit your questions anytime. I don't want to disrupt the presentation too much, but if there is something relevant, I will ask a question. But we also have a dedicated Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. All right, we've got Chris from Oklahoma.
Let's go.
All right, and yes, here we have Katie and Nick, and this is the agenda. So we're going to look at some of the biggest trends from our 2021 competitive enablement report. We're also going to look at what you should be prioritizing for your revenue teams, and also how you can create competitive content or use the competitive content you have at your disposal to really help retention strategies. And then there's the Q&A and wrap up. So I will pass this over to you, Katie.
Thank you.
And let you take it away.
Thanks, Adam. And yeah, you can totally interrupt my section for sure with questions. Nir will be happy to answer any questions that you have to ask today. Also, I would just like to say, because I had to call in from home and couldn't go into an office, I have notoriously bad internet. There's like a 99% chance that I'm going to cut out for like 30 seconds at some point in this webinar. And I really hope that the two of you can fill in the gap as I have a frozen face. So that's what
you should pretend to have a frozen face every so often to keep on our toes.
To test you.
Yeah.
I'm so afraid of when it's going to happen, because usually it happens when I get fully into some rant of some sort with emotional energy. That's when it likes to happen to me, when it knows I'm like really snowballing into some sort of point. Anyways, really excited about the webinar that we're going to run today. To give a little bit of context, about a year ago, sort of when COVID was first on the scene, we were doing a lot of feedback and connecting closely with a lot of our customers to find out what was happening, like what was the impact on their competitive intelligence programs. And we were finding some really interesting insights into the impact that it was having on their competitive enablement priorities. And we also took a look at the information that sort of existed in the market, and felt like there was generally a gap not just about how to run a competitive intelligence program, but really about what stakeholders want from competitive intelligence programs. And I think we found that there's a huge information gap in what we know stakeholders are looking for when it comes to enabling the organization with competitive insights. So we wanted to do some research to look into it. And Nir, like, please add some color to any of this as I'm going through my section.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool beansies. So we did a bit of a survey. We surveyed over 500 people, the majority of which are in B2B. So we talked to stakeholders across the company, and that really included executives, people from product teams, marketing teams, sales, customer success, essentially like every stakeholder across the organization. And we also spoke to teams that were managing competitive programs. So when we say CI teams or CI professionals, that includes product marketers or any person's role who is managing the competitive intelligence program in their organization. 90% of the organizations that we surveyed had 500 or more employees working at them. So really, just as some context for this, it's mid to large sort of enterprise for the organizations that we've spoken to. And the first piece of information was really, I think, a confirmation of what we expected, which is that competitive teams are overwhelmingly prioritizing sales, and specifically high growth companies. 70% of high growth companies are supporting sales as their first primary stakeholder who's supported by their competitive intelligence program. This is the same when we looked at companies who were not in high growth phases. They still were primarily supporting sales as their top priority, although it was more, I think it was closer to 30% of moderate growth organizations were prioritizing sales first. I think that it's interesting to see. It makes sense, and I think it made sense to us as well when we think about high growth companies and where they're at as a business. It's likely that net new business is going to be a strategic priority for them. It's also likely that a company that's in a high growth phase is in a lucrative market. It's going to be a highly competitive market. So to me, I think it just made sense that sales teams are going to require the most support in order to ensure that they're closing as many competitive deals as possible.
Yeah, and I think that mirrors a lot of across all of my customers. If I were just to do, if you held a gun to my head and said, what do you think that number would look like? I would say probably even higher than 70%. And often it's kind of creates that bubble that obviously we'll get to in a bit, but where we think that it should be the only priority, but it's because often like CI is also driven by sales teams from a bottoms up approach as well, where they're often the ones asking about it the most, feel the most need short term with that as well. So this isn't that surprising across all of our customers as well.
Yeah. So just to share this in a bit of a different way, we asked and we split up the responses both from stakeholders across the organization and then competitive teams to ask the question of what benefits do you expect to see from your company's investment into your competitive program. And on the stakeholder side, and I mean, across both, I think what we see is alignment in terms of prioritizing sales and the importance of supporting sales across the business. What's interesting is that on the competitive side, for the competitive teams, it wasn't ranked as number one. And we will get to what number their top benefit was that they expect to see from their competitive program a little later in their presentation. I'd be interested if anyone has guesses in the chat about what that might be. But overall, I think the takeaway here is still improving sales performance is seen as the top priority across all teams, or a top priority, I suppose. However, where it starts to get interesting is I think that teams aren't entirely aligned on how competitive should support the business. And we started to see this come out in some of the other data points. And so when we look at stakeholders, it seems that they really prioritize, they don't just care about new revenue, but supporting all revenue teams. And what we saw is their third top ranked benefit for CI programs was improving customer retention. And where this was interesting is looking at where this ranked with our competitive teams. And they ranked that as second last. Only 9% of competitive teams felt that improving customer retention was an expected benefit to be seen from their competitive programs. So this is where I think we start to see a bit of that misalignment, or potentially like a bit of the opportunity to realign and understand what stakeholders are looking for or expecting from competitive programs, and how that's reflected in the objectives and priorities of the teams and competitive teams and what they're doing today. Then we sliced the information one more time. So now instead of just looking at stakeholders, all stakeholders across the organization, we took a look at what specifically the C-suite was expecting from their competitive programs. And this was a bit of a surprise, to be honest. They have ranked improving customer retention as the #1 expected benefit from their competitive programs. Again, sort of in comparison with competitive teams, you can really see that there's differences in the expected priorities of what a competitive enablement program should be doing for the business. Nir, I don't know if you have any other things to speak
Yeah,
of.
I mean, it's quite surprising, but also not really, because, back to my point about how when I think about the idea of like sales driving these conversations when they come on board with us, for example, and we think about, okay, what is it that we want to do short term? I think a lot of it is also just the mindset of a lot of companies in terms of what does retention, like when does the actual customer relationship begin, like that transition? Is there actually a transition, or is that customer, always being sold to and in a competitive environment? So I think at a C-suite level, it kind of makes sense where they understand, how that customer could leave, what are the hurdles that they have to go through. They've seen it at a more strategic level. And I think with like CI teams, because so much of it is focused around like that sales enablement piece, it's about kind of differentiating, like, what does that transition period look like for that customer, or even if there is one at all. And I think that sort of mindset has to change a bit. And so this isn't as surprising as I, initially thought, but it makes sense to how like teams look at it.
Yeah, and I mean, another thing that I think about when I look at the importance of improving customer retention and where the mindset of C-suite might be on this is obviously customer success teams are the like front-facing lines in terms of dealing with customers, but I think there's also maybe some meaning in here around the importance of making sure that like product teams are supported with the competitive insights so that product can remain competitive in the market, that like every team, it still requires multiple teams to be aligned in order to retain customers. So when I look at this and thought about it a little bit more, improving customer retention certainly is about enabling your customer facing teams. It's also about making sure that all teams across the organization are aligned in such a way that we're not just bringing on new customers, but what we're offering in terms of platform service experience is going to retain them in the long term as well.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Okay, so this is where it felt a little bit ironic, but now we show you what CI teams felt was the #1 most important priority for themselves. And that was this improvement in executive strategy and alignment. That's what competitive teams have said is their top expected benefit. Whereas to the C-suite themselves, they've ranked that 5th, and that's below customer retention, improving sales performance, sales training, and product strategy. And so again, I think those 4 pieces speak to my last point a little bit, that making sure all those teams are aligned on delivering to customers is going to improve customer retention. And found it interesting that their own enablement was sort of 5th on the list here.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, the number of customers that, even when I ask them sort of like, what are our short-term goals and things like that, I think there's definitely this idea that, making sure that we please leadership or we satisfy their needs, and that will then kind of trickle down across the entire organization in its own way, rather than actually work with some of those teams and kind of work with them sort of in a bottoms up approach. Because as much as we get like executives believing in CI, I think what you just brought up about the idea of CI becoming, or like competitive intelligence as a whole becoming a part of like the organizational philosophy, isn't necessarily always going to come up from like a top-down approach. There also needs to be across the teams, like they need to understand the value to their day-to-day, things like that. So I often find the executive strategy piece is often tied to this idea that like, that's the easy way to get this like trickle down approach of CI across the entire organization, when in reality, it's just, when you kind of start to filter all that out, it often doesn't hit the people on the ground. And then ultimately you have this huge gap in terms of what the actual value of CI is across a lot of teams.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So just to wrap this up, it does seem, I think, like looking at top priorities of C-suite stakeholders, what we're seeing is this articulated importance of enabling revenue teams. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at why stakeholders are caring so much about customer retention. And Adam, I don't know who gave this to you. Maybe it was Adam, our VP of Customer Success, but I felt that this was a really good graph that illustrates the importance of retention on the business, not just net new revenue on the business. So what this is showing is really an example of two companies over the period of 5 years, both starting out in year one with the same amount in annual recurring revenue of $6 million, but having different net revenue retention rates and the impact that it has on the growth of the company over time. So company A, which is in the light green, has a net revenue retention rate of 95%, meaning that of their revenue from a, say, cohort of customers, they're only retaining 95% of it. So potential churn or contraction of contracts happening with that company, versus company B in the dark green has a net revenue retention rate of 120. So what you're potentially seeing there is retaining customers, is expanding customer revenue. And the impact of those two net revenue retention rates over 5 years actually ends up a difference of $140 million in revenue. So I felt this is a really good way to just illustrate the importance of retention on the business as opposed to net new business. And I think it's very common for salespeople to need competitive enablement because they're facing off in outwardly obvious competitive deals. And what we probably see with customer success teams is that it's less likely that you're always obviously up against a competitor that's going to, with a customer that may or may not churn. But it's interesting to see the impact of that and to think through how that can help to shape, I guess, the priorities of your competitive program.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure this is near and dear to your heart, Katie, from the marketing side, but I've been at two companies where I would say that net retention rate kind of like mirrors the companies that I was at. And another big sort of like difference at a like qualitative level, like kind of maybe that could speak to some of this data, is if you think about when you keep some of your most strategic customers and your big customers, that only provides more ammunition in terms of case studies, success stories that you can then lean on to help bring in new business as well, or keep existing business. I think the more you can show that you've kept these customers longer term, it's a huge sign to other companies. I mean, think about the companies that are monitoring, like I have customers that monitor their competitors in terms of the logos they lose and the logos they gain. And they're looking at it over, a longer period of time, where like they're seeing, wow, there's quite a bit of turnover with this company. There's a big gap that we can take advantage of. And so I think the ones that can kind of keep these customers longer term, it only adds to the value that you can bring to your sales teams as well, in terms of like really strong, longer term case studies, success stories that have much more, many more layers to it, rather than just here are the like quick hit, like low hanging fruit ROI pieces. Now you have, here's over 5 years, this customer, look at all of that, all of the work that they've done. They've gone from, say, a lower level of maturity within their industry to something that's far greater, because of the fact that they've been able to kind of stick with them for a longer period of time. So those are some of the things that I noticed just being at two companies that kind of had these sort of net retention rates. I think just on the customer success side, I knew, like when I was at the one that had a higher net retention rate, I just had a huge catalog of great customer stories to work off of, and especially customers that loved our platform. They loved to be able to speak on behalf for us and kind of had a deeper relationship as well. So there's definitely a lot of tangential ways that I think retention has an impact in other areas of the business.
Yeah. One thing that this, I mean, underlines for me, coming from the marketing perspective, is marketing's role in bringing in the types of like leads and types of customers that are going to be successful long term. And so there's actually a lot of importance in marketing being on the same page around where do we sit in the market, where are we best positioned in the market, and who are the types of customers that are set up to be successful with us long term. And if a marketing team is doing its job right, they're bringing in the types of opportunities and leads that are going to have more successful net revenue retention in the long run, because you're working with the right customer base that is a fit for you as a company and where you sit in the market. So there's a
Yeah,
piece there too.
totally. Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Okay, so just my last slide here. This was another interesting data point that we found in our competitive enablement report, which was we asked teams what the impact of COVID had on the importance and visibility of their programs, and was really interested to see that overwhelmingly most people were saying they had increased importance and visibility. Because of that, I think it wasn't necessarily surprising. And when you think about what happened to pipelines, when pipelines shrink, what you have are fewer deals. But for the deals that will close, it becomes and became more important than ever to make sure that you were going to win any of those competitive deals. And I think, again, the importance of customer retention was really increased and put under a magnifying glass through that time as well, just through the pressure that we were all facing in the market.
Yeah, and just to speak to this sort of anecdotally as well, I think working in an office, sales teams tend to be the loudest folks in the room. So I just absorb by like osmosis most of competitive information, because I would just have to listen to them yell while I'm trying to do my work. So I think all of that is gone because now I'm working from home. And I think if anything, just even for myself personally on like a customer success team, I am not absorbing any of that info, you know, and I think that's where having some sort of tool or a platform where I can kind of like keep up to date with info that's happening within the marketplace, things like that. It's just information that I don't have access to. I've lost all of that water cooler conversation. And so if anything, it's kind of like, it's made me have a self-reckoning of how much do I know about my competitors that I might be dealing with. And I've realized I know very little. And that's where I need to make more of an effort to kind of get engaged with that competitive program.
That was actually, you're speaking to a really interesting point, because one of the key things that we were seeing about a year ago was this crazy critical role that competitive programs were playing in acting as almost command central for their organization. So all of a sudden their role became really about collecting information from all of these different teams about what they were hearing from the field, what they were hearing from customers, centralizing it all in one place, and then acting as that team that was meant to get everyone on the same page and share out information. And so you're probably right. I mean, I don't want to speak for people, but it feels like all working from home, the silos that we can find ourselves in make it even more critical for there to be sort of a central team that's focused on taking the insights and intel from across teams and making sure that everyone who needs to have access to it is able to find the information that they need.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Okay.
All right. So now to get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation. So what I wanted to kind of go through, this is going to be a combination of just some of the work that I'm doing with some of our customers, as well as what I've heard, having worked on sort of like the post-sale side or like the account management side, things that have helped me or things that I've recognized are also gaps in my understanding of like the competitive marketplace and why that's important. So what I'm kind of go through is, we touched on this a little bit earlier, is just about the idea of how do you change the mindset within an organization that kind of looks at CI across a number of different teams outside of the sales team. So we're going to work around sort of like the idea of like the post-sales team or like the, you know, account management side. But a lot of this can be applied to product teams, marketing teams. It's really an exploration of how do I start to figure out what we don't know and get that into the hands of people that need that information. Next slide. So I'm going to start with, I don't know if the ship has sailed on Suez Canal memes. I'm supposed to pause for applause there. I'll give you guys a second to let that one sink in.
How relatable, how relevant.
I had created this before the ship actually was unstuck. But basically what I'm trying to illustrate here is, when I'm, as an account manager or anyone that's working post sales, when we're handed off the account, there's sort of this like workflow and processes that we're used to, and it's pretty much smooth sailing, or at least we think it is, at least for the early part. And then there hits a point where a customer, mentions a competitor, or someone within their organization is evaluating a certain competitor. And it's very disruptive to that workflow. So everything that we were kind of working on towards that renewal or keeping that customer, it really kind of sends that ship completely off track, and is one of the biggest sort of flags that we will start to look at in terms of churn. And when an account manager hears that, like, they are not armed with a lot of resources in general, because that's not, you don't see it often enough, or you don't attribute what some of those signals are to competitors. I think that's the challenge there. And what I'm trying to kind of illustrate in the next few slides is, how do we get the mindset to change where we start to notice those signals and kind of attribute it to potential competitors, or maybe how that marketplace is changing, and kind of having some of that causality there. So next slide. So when I speak about sort of this retention river, it's actually not something that's very short and sweet. It's a long process. That customer lifecycle, obviously you want to keep that customer for a long time. But what I really want to illustrate here is that the selling never stops. So as much as we think of, hey, we've got this customer on board, we've done all this work, there was a very competitive deal cycle, we're able to knock out all these competitors, we're celebrating this huge win, it's a big win story, we're going to add to like a win story card in our battle cards, and then we hand it off to an account manager or post sales or the training team, and suddenly that resource shift is dramatic. We've gone from putting in all these resources, whether it's product marketing resources or product resources in terms of getting teams involved with the evaluation process, to a team that doesn't necessarily have all of these resources, but yet our competitors are still bombarding our customers with, whether it's marketing content, webinar content, best practices. They're reaching out to your champions, they're reaching out to your executive sponsors, economic decision makers, because to them, they still see an opportunity. Just maybe it might be much more of a longer term opportunity here, but it's not like they've walked away from this and said, we're never going to speak to this customer again. They're continuing. So with that in mind, I think as a post-sales team, what you have to keep in mind is that this is happening in the background. You're just not totally aware of it. So what can we do as sales enablement or product marketing or people that are working within that CI program? How do we get to our post-sales teams in a way that makes sense to them and gets them the right information that they need, so they can constantly be fending this off, or at least be aware of, okay, what are the signals I need to keep my eye out for? Because I think the mindset that we take is that it's our failures that lead to churn. It's that, like, we didn't necessarily hit the timelines that our customer was looking for, or our product didn't meet the needs that they needed at this time. But when you really dig into that, it's often because, like, our competitors are continuing to bombard them with landmines. They're continuing to bombard them with questions to ask their account management team or their economic decision makers with, hey, is this still important to you? If it is, we know we've heard this about customer X, like, keep an eye out for it. So really, I want to kind of drill home the idea that the selling never stops. And this is going to be sort of the crux of how you want to structure your strategies with those teams as well, outside of sales.
Yeah. Adam did, next slide, I'm on it. Adam wrote a blog post that he published last week that starts off with an actual email, I believe, from one of our own competitors who, like an SDR reaching out to one of our customers, because it's such a good reminder that as like a marketing leader myself, we run rip and replace campaigns. We have SDRs that are constantly hitting up our own competitors' customers. Everyone's SDR teams are doing that. So you're 100% right that behind the scenes, happening every single day, people are reaching out to your customers. It's not only about what you as a customer success person are doing to maintain that relationship. There's a whole bunch of tactics happening at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's just things that we're totally unaware of it. And often it's actually not even our champion that hears about this. It could be other people that are being reached out to. So this kind of leads into, when I work with our customers and we're building out sort of our strategy with like sales teams, for example, customer success teams or account management teams are never really put into the mix, because when they go to ask those teams like, hey, do you need CI, or, is CI important in your workflow? A lot of them will say, no, not really. Competitors aren't really involved in my renewals or anything like that. And I think that's often the case, a classic example of where those post-sales teams, what they actually know is very limited in scope in terms of, here's what I need to do to kind of deliver on my project timelines, get this customer successful. But there's so much that we don't know. And I think it's things that like a customer success or account manager actually isn't aware of how much they don't know. And that's where we, as, whether it's product marketers or sales enablement, here's an opportunity to kind of get them to think about how much they don't know. Have the exercises where you sort of challenge them to think outside of those boxes that they're currently thinking of. And that's the way to kind of start to generate, okay, what are the areas of need for these teams? Because you're not going to get, today, I would say for the most part, a lot of my customers, when they go to do their, they go and ask anecdotally, like, does competitor X come into this renewal or anything like that? You'll often find that a account manager will tend to say, no, not really. It was more, it was faults of our own. And that's because they're still restricting themselves to what they know, which is, I know about our product, I know about our pricing, I know about our contract process, whatever it might be, but not taking into account that there could be this potential where it's like the changing marketplace, the industry is changing, a new competitor has come on board that comes out with a new flashy product. And that's kind of changed how our economic decision maker looks at these things. So a lot of what you need to do is try to bring out what you don't know, and really get a customer. And it's not to basically say like, here's a list of things you don't know. It's actually just to get them thinking and realizing how much they don't know. That sort of will help drive their need to kind of reach out to you and build out like, hey, here are my needs for like a CI team, because now I realize actually there's so much I don't know. And I think that's sort of that first step that you need. Next slide. So one of the ways to kind of think about this as well is I always ask, what sort of changed with what hasn't. So I'm talking about that sort of transition period when you go from, hey, you've closed the deal, you're handing it off. Let's think about what stayed the same. So our economic decision maker or executive sponsors probably stayed the same. The ROI, overall ROI story that they were looking for out of your specific business or platform or tool or whatever it might be, business objectives, those all remain the same. And then as well, procurement might have had some must-haves. So there's sort of like that high-level checklist of you have to do these certain things. There's a reason why they came on board. But there's actually a lot that's changed once that handoff happens. And then throughout that customer relationship that you need to start thinking about. And these are things that you need to start factoring into your CI content as well. And this is where, think about like the day-to-day contexts have changed. The champion might have changed where it's been passed off from an executive sponsor to a project manager or someone else. So this is now starting to be your audience within that organization. The evaluation criteria might have changed where we're thinking very high level strategic. Now let's start getting into the granular product needs, things like that. So that could have changed timelines. We're now thinking about implementation, enablement, all of these more granular timelines. Those are things that become areas that you want to be able to kind of have information on that as well. And then as well, you're meeting new teams and new people as well. Whenever you pass this off, it moves from like an executive team or a sales team, for example, and it could go into like a product team or marketing team. These are all new relationships, all new contexts, all new needs, and opportunities for you as well to make sure that you kind of build in those deeper relationships, because it will ultimately longer term also provide you insights into that customer's business, things that from a pre-sales you might not have initially. So these are the things that I kind of want to focus on, because this is areas where you can quickly leverage an existing CI program to just basically layer on these pieces that take advantage of these two main sort of takeaways that you have once you pass that off. Next slide. Yeah. But what's really stayed the same is, as we've talked about, is that your competitors haven't stopped selling to your customers. So instead of you're in this competitive deal cycle, you're all kind of attacking this in a very similar way, going after the executive sponsors, going after those sort of like business objectives and the procurement must-haves. If there was an RFP, it's a very similar battle. What's changed though is now your competitors are actually starting to, they know that they've lost you, so their approach is changing slightly. They're going to start to go after some of your day-to-day contacts that they know of, like maybe some of the, for myself with some of our customers, it's like the product marketers, it's the analysts, for example, start to kind of like feed information in different areas. They all also know that the evaluation criteria has changed. So how do I deposition these things, knowing all of these things that have changed, but the content that's been built out for a CI program is still very much focused on what had stayed the same, right? But not so much what has changed. And that's when I talk to sort of those post-sales teams and customer success teams, and I ask them, why aren't you using CI content? They often find it's like, that information isn't super relevant to me because it isn't taking into account all of these things that have changed for my day-to-day. And so as product marketers or, CI program, like enablement teams, you need to also consider what's changed for those teams and address that, because that's the only way they're going to really sort of adopt that information. Next slide. The other piece that, so kind of moving into now how to kind of get that information from your customer success teams or account management teams. There's sort of two approaches that I recommend to a lot of our customers, because this is going to be, kind of starting from scratch for the most part. There isn't, and we've seen it, right? Where traditionally our stakeholders do believe in customer retention being an important piece, but our CI teams haven't prioritized that. Because of that, there needs to be that gap needs to be filled. And there's going to be a lot of information you need to gather first. So what I tend to recommend is start with, surveying your teams today, finding out what you already know. And that's sort of that piece when I mentioned earlier. It's like, get all of the information of what, CS teams think they know, and get that. And that could be when are competitors being evaluated, which stakeholders are exploring competitors. So this could be, this is where some of those changes are important. And also like, what else are they evaluating? Like, what are the things that have changed in terms of evaluation criteria? Another big piece that I highly recommend is, I tend to see we attribute reasons for churn often to like high level categories like product, for example, or pricing. And when I look at it and I pull that data later, I will attribute product to just failures maybe within our own product. And that's what we attribute it to. Not realizing, okay, let's do a deep dive into some of these product churn reasons. Was it integrations, for example? If so, integrations, do we know that competitor X, Y, and Z have those integrations? Oh, 2 of them do. Did that have an impact on some of our stakeholders that were aware that those integrations exist in the marketplace? And that ultimately led to our customers saying, hey, because you don't have this integration, we're not going to move forward. We've only simply attributed that to product within our own scope, but not realizing that that competitive landscape had a major influence on that. You'll often find that our customers, when they talk about product or pricing or anything like that, it's often coming subconsciously from what they're hearing about what the marketplace looks like, what are other, people in their space doing, what they're hearing is successful, and then they're factoring that in to things that they might say in your day-to-day. I've had, customers that have challenged me on certain things where it's completely come out of the blue. Everything's moving along fine, and then someone's like, mentions an integration that I was like, you had never talked about that. And then I realized there was a ton of marketing done by a bunch of our competitors around that integration. And suddenly, everything has changed. And I now need to go in and find out, okay, how do I deposition that specific piece? So that's where doing a little bit of a deep dive into some of those reasons for churn is super important.
There's also probably on the what I already know side, a piece that could be pulled just out of data, not through survey, which is like when your own customer renewals are scheduled for, and being able to get ahead of the ball sort of 90 days out from that, to understand that if a customer is going to be evaluating another tool, it's likely to start at that sort of a time frame. So there should be a lot of data that could actually be pulled out of existing CRM systems as well to support that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like another big difference between the advantage that like a post-sales team has is they have so much more time to work with. So they can make very slow and strategic depositioning decisions, like it's like, hey, how do I like start to plant these landmines that last over a longer time versus, a sales rep that might need to have quick info on the spot, and so you have that time to work with. So that's also something to keep in mind, where it's, information where you can go more in depth versus breadth for certain competitors. The piece that I love and I highly recommend as well, and I've seen a lot of our customers sort of employ this strategy, and it's worked really well within their organizations, especially where there's a lot of I don't know, is role play your business against competitors. The idea is challenge your post-sales teams to have situations where a competitor is jumping in at different stages of a customer lifecycle. So think of like implementation, for example, that early onboarding period. There's a competitor that jumps in and setting up landmines that are related to your implementation, for example. What does that look like? How equipped are the CS teams, for example, if that does happen? What do they need? Think about a different part of the life cycle where it might be, that executive business review in a year, or, whatever it might be, those different stages. Experiment and provide scenarios and actually challenge your, CS teams, like have sort of that enablement session where it's like, hey, we just want to know, what would happen if a competitor comes in here and what would you need? And once you start experimenting with that, that's where you break the like that little things that I know, and I'm going to stick with that, to really exposing them to like all of these ways that's like, wow, there's a lot I don't know. And it's going to drive that need for, hey, can you help me get what I don't know? And suddenly CI becomes a huge piece of their day-to-day as well.
I think one of the things that sales teams naturally do really well is they're very attuned to hearing those landmines or objections in their deals, which indicate to them that there's a competitor also being evaluated. I would say there's probably like training that needs to happen with customer success teams to build up their ability to be attuned to those landmines and objections that they maybe aren't hearing as often, but are really important indicators that a competitor might be seeding your customer with ideas about what's important.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's just really kind of getting this mindset out of hearing what you only want to hear because of what I know, and being able to start to pick up signals where it's like, because I know this could happen, that must be like, let me start to at least kind of branch out and think, okay, maybe there is a competitor at play. And it's totally true. You rarely hear landmines as directly as you might during the sales process, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. Next slide. Okay, so when we think about what we want to prioritize for customer success teams, I think there's two areas that I think are sort of that low-hanging fruit if I were to recommend what you could quickly get to. So there's the sort of how to spot and then the quick dismiss as well. And this goes back to what, when we think about like the overall sort of battle card hierarchy, when we're building it for sales, we have sort of that identify that competitor. Here's how you can quickly dismiss it. But then we get into like some of those like really granular details in terms of, objection handling, and here's all the different ways the product works. And then the ugly details, which is like feature comparisons and pricing grids. When I think about it on the CS side, we have a couple big advantages. So next slide. Let's think about what's changed and how we can sort of leverage that advantage against our competition. What I really want to focus on is those deeper relationships, the insight into customers' business, and then what Katie mentioned a little bit earlier is that evaluation time. We have a lot more time to work with, and leveraging those deeper relationships that our account managers might have with their champions. You can actually use the how to spot quick dismiss very easily, because you're basically arming people that do love working with you, or believe in the product, but there's someone else, some other stakeholder that's evaluating maybe a competitor. Just getting them that information quickly, you're just able to kind of get ahead of this far quicker. And you can also start to slowly pick up on these signals and see the things that you need to, knowing that there's a detractor within the organization that you're going to have to fend off come renewal time. So here, you've got now a year to work through all the different ways that you can start to kind of, quickly bring in some quick dismiss points that you can arm your champion with. So when they have those internal reviews or anything like that. So when you're thinking about how to kind of go in depth on these specific cards, it's really, how do I arm our CS people that have those deeper relationships, know a lot more about that customer's business, because they've been able to kind of get an inside look into that, and then also take advantage of that significant amount of evaluation time that they have to work with. This is where, just as low-hanging fruit, here's some 2 quick ways to kind of provide that, but also keep in mind, work with all the information that you've just gathered as well, and figure out how you can repackage a lot of the assets that you have, that keep in mind all of the other things that have changed, whether it's the day-to-day contacts, the champions, the evaluation, what other teams might be involved, and how that might look. Next slide. So just like a big takeaway from all of this is, I tell, when I work with our customers, the immediate sort of, it's like, I don't want to have to build out a customer success CI program, or I don't want to have to build out an account management CI program. And what you would find is that the same way that I kind of said, by just osmosis, I was getting enough information just overhearing things. There's not a lot that a CS person really needs, but it's, just giving them enough that they, over a longer period of time, they've got the right tool. So it's really just about like repackaging what you have currently, and then just taking that to what you've learned about what they need. And I really recommend going in depth on like the quick dismiss and the how to spot for your CS teams, rather than the breadth of competitors. Because one thing I've also learned is that the competitor scope will change once that customer's on board, because think about how much of a change management exercise it is as well to make any of these changes. So they're not going to go from evaluating 30 competitors. They're actually going to start to be much more granular about, here's 2 or 3 we know even the cost of change still might be okay with knowing that these competitors can do X, Y, and Z, rather than going at like 30 competitors where there might be a lot more differences in what that cost of change management might look like.
Makes sense.
Okay, perfect. And so again, just a quick overview of sort of like the how to spot card, if anyone hasn't seen it. Really think of this as the ways to kind of arm, a sales rep or a CS team with what are the clues that they might need to be on the lookout for when a competitor might be in play. And this goes back to the type of questions, the terminology that might be used. Every company kind of has like a different approach to the terms that they use. And if you start to hear stakeholders use specific term, you're like, oh, I know where that they're getting that from. So those are the things that I think, just at a high level, are quick ways for a CS team to kind of identify those. Next slide. And then the quick dismiss. So this is really, I often say like 3 to 4 high level points of what are the things that if I were to arm my champion when they go in for their internal discussions, can kind of quickly brush off any sort of conversation that happens, where it be, we know this is their top criteria. Here's how like that competitor just isn't strong in that area. So having that quick dismiss is super, super helpful, because these are the things that you want to also arm your champions that are having these conversations internally to try to drive off any sort of competitor before it gets back to you. And now you're in a competitive renewal cycle.
I think one of the key things that we talk about being important about the quick dismiss is that it needs to not be about product features necessarily. It needs to start with that high level positioning. How are you different than your competitors in the market at a high level? Where are you different in a way that's easy to understand for customers? And then after that, supporting it with maybe specific product points, but rolling it up into one concise sort of positioning statement about how you're different in the market and where you win.
Exactly. And then last slide, I believe. So yeah, again, here's, just an example battle card that kind of provides, like, you don't see any pricing, you don't see product feature comparisons or anything like that. What I try to say is, with any sort of like, post sales or customer success, you're really thinking about what are just sort of the strategic things that they need to know and be able to arm their teams with. And this is just provides you some examples of where you can actually this is a lot of content that a sales team could use or has been using. And this is just a way that's structured so that if I'm a CS person and I go into my like CS specific battle card, here's the things that I'll need to know. And this goes back to understanding that a CS person doesn't feel enabled by sales related content per se, because it sometimes is structured for a different audience. So this could be more structured towards like knowing that my day-to-day contexts have changed, or, my evaluation criteria has changed. Here's what I just need to know to quickly dismiss all of that.
I think also this is super relevant for anyone who is starting out in building their competitive enablement program, starting with how to spot them and those high level quick dismiss and depositioning statements. That also, I would guess, would be exactly where we'd recommend you start if you're building a competitive program from scratch as well.
Yeah. And I mean, on the theme of like repackaging existing, ideas, this framework is what we use for teams that are starting from scratch with their CI programs as well. Whether it's like understanding what's changed, that sort of framework, understanding what I don't know, surveying teams, the role playing, the quick dismiss, how to spot them, focusing on depth versus breadth. All of that is also the framework we use for, if you're a CI program that's just starting from scratch. All of that is centered around the idea, like, we want to change the mindset of our organization to move into where CI isn't necessarily this like nice to have, but it becomes like a must have in all of our conversations, to understand that, that selling never stops regardless. And we're in competitive deals, whether we know it or not.
Another thing that I think is really important, and what I really love about this battle card example, is the links that are provided out to further cards. So one of the things we say is really important is making your content digestible to the people who are reading it. So providing your quick dismiss at a very high level, your different statements, and then providing links out to customer stories, to reviews that support that perspective, to other marketing or sales enablement resources. Making that all linked to from your battle cards allows people to like sort through your competitive enablement content in a way that works for them. So not everyone wants to go to great depth in terms of training themselves on how to deposition against competitors, but the best approach that you can take is by linking out to further information, keeping things very concise, and then allowing the people who want to go really in depth with your content to find that and access that. So I think that's an important functionality to point out in how you've structured this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you think about all the static decks and PDFs that you think of, often you lose people because they're like, wait, I have to read through all of this, rather than giving the opportunity to be like, no, I'm just actually interested in this. Let me do a deep dive into that, and being able to link out to that, I think, is super important. Yeah. So I guess as just key takeaways, as Katie mentioned, competitive programs are expected to impact revenue in the sense that it's not, I think all of this is really about the idea that, it doesn't just stop when the sale is done and the deal is closed. I think from a stakeholder perspective, we've seen the expectation is that customer retention exists further down the road as well. And it's important for the long-term health of any company to make sure that they prioritize that. And so when we're thinking about that sales cycle is ongoing, we need to be also cognizant and aware that those teams that are post-sales, for example, are we sure that they're enabled and have the resources to actually, be able to help support when a competitive deal might occur? And that's where, again, I don't want people to kind of walk away from this being like, I need to go in and pitch the idea that we need to have a whole new CI program that's delivering to post-sales teams or anything like that. What I'd rather you do is take away that sales process. If we think of it as just one continuous process, let's just use what we have, existing content, and just find new audiences, different needs, and address it in a way that we kind of build in this mindset across the organization that if we know that the sales cycle is ongoing, it's not to create this new siloed program that only exists for post-sales. I think what we want to do is break that down, because I think even from a post-sales perspective, there's a lot of impact that it'll have for a sales team where you take that slow, methodical way of approaching deep positioning. How can sales learn from that as well, where they're constantly having to do fast on the quick decisions? Maybe there's insights that they can learn from. Here's how seeding over the longer term helped as well.
Boom.
All right. That was
Thanks,
that went in depth. That was awesome there. All right, we've gone pretty overtime on this one here. We only have about 5 minutes or so left for some questions. So we'll try to get to a couple. And then we'll send everyone on their way. One of the first questions I've seen here is there valuable information like sharing from CS teams that other teams can use in their competitive program?
So within an organization, so how information from a CS team could help impact maybe a sales team?
I think that's what they're asking.
Yeah, I think when I mentioned the what's changed, the insights that you get into the customer's business, for example, can help, when we create content regarding the industry overall, right? We now have an inside look in some industries that we might not have known about. So you can use that insight to actually really build out what your objection handling and landmines might look like. It just provides sort of an inside look, into an industry that you definitely won't have access to. So I think there are ways in which, I think about a lot of the sales reps that, will ping me about questions. And often it is around, trying to understand how this customer works, like how the operation looks, and can you give me any insight into that? Because then that can help them guide in terms of the questions they might ask a different similar looking customer as well.
I think you probably see customer success teams feeding into a competitive intelligence program, in that a lot of the customer stories that they can surface and share are used to support the approach that you're going to enable your sales teams with as to how to handle common objections or specific landmines. That's, I think, a hypercritical part of what customer success teams do to feed into an overall competitive program.
Another one here, actually, this one's interesting. Are competitive programs using churn rate as a metric to measure their success?
No, but I think that's where, it's when we think about that gap, right? Where it's still just like a big mindset change. What are we thinking about in terms of our goals and objectives? I will say personally across my customers, that's even when they start to bring on their customer success teams, churn rate isn't something that they're looking at, but I think that's a great way to look at it as well. It's like when we want to tell that ROI story, I think that'll be a big piece as well. And I think when I go back to the idea of deep diving on the reasons for churn, this is where there's that opportunity, right? Where you're going to start to actually be able to tell that story of how churn rate is impacting or has been impacted by the competitive landscape, is when you start to deep dive into those reasons.
I was just saying, we actually got a comment. One of the attendees actually says they do use churn rate attributed to competitors to understand the trend. So I guess the key there is being able to attribute it to a competitor as well.
Well, that's,
Yeah.
I was going to say that's similar to on the sales side, how we say to measure sort of ROI of the competitive program is not just looking at win rate, but it's looking at competitive win rate and looking at also the win rate of the people on your sales team who are using your competitive content versus not, and the difference in their competitive win rate as understanding the impact of your enablement efforts. I think similar to Edward's point, looking at churn rate, not just churn rate as an indicator, because there's so many variables that attribute to that, but the competitive, like churn rate lost to customer data point would be a really interesting one to look at. 100%, that's a real great point.
All right, we've gone overtime there, hour on the dot right there. If you have any other questions, you can send them through to us. You could contact us on LinkedIn. You could go to the Clue account. You could direct contact Katie or Nusan directly on there. And yeah, we've got, because we couldn't get to as many questions as we'd like to, but I think that was a really good conversation. So thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.